I knew the exact weight of that blade. 3 kilos of pure steel, 90 centimeters of metal forged under the intense desert heat. My fingers had held that sword many times before, always with the same firmness, the same unwavering conviction. I had witnessed executions in the central square, seen the glint of steel cutting through the air, heard the dull thud of heads falling onto the flawless marble. I knew exactly how to do it. The correct angle, the necessary pressure, the movement that leaves no room for error. But when I raised that sword above my younger brother's neck, something inexplicable happened. The blade bent, as if it had lost all its rigidity, all its deadly nature. It was as if the metal itself refused to obey. And there, in that instant frozen in time, the entire structure of my faith began to crack. Every certainty I had carried for decades simply shattered. My name is Rashid Al-Fahad, and this is the story of how I lost everything to find the truth. For 18 years, I served as Imam at the Grand Mosque in Riyadh, one of the most important temples in all of Saudi Arabia. Every Friday, my voice echoed through the marble columns as 5,000 men bowed in prayer behind me. My clothes were always white, without a single stain. The turban wrapped around my head with the precision that only years of tradition can teach. My beard dyed with henna, following every detail of the customs I inherited from my ancestors. As I walked through the sacred halls, I sensed the silent respect around me. Men averted their gaze, not out of disdain, but out of reverence. Women moved out of my way. Small children watched me pass and whispered to their parents, their eyes wide. A mixture of fascination and a certain fear. I represented spiritual authority, religious knowledge, moral power, and I liked that. I liked being important, being listened to, being feared when necessary. 42 years old. That was my age when everything started to fall apart. It wasn't a dramatic, sudden collapse. It was something more subtle, more disturbing. It began with a call in the middle of the night at 3:15 a.m. on a day I will never forget. March 19th. My cell phone vibrated on the bedside table, breaking the absolute silence of my house in the upscale Al Malk neighborhood. The illuminated screen showed a number I didn't recognize. My first instinct was to ignore it. Calls like that rarely bring good news. But something inexplicable made me answer, an uneasy intuition I couldn't ignore. "Imam Al-Fahad," I said from the other end of the line, my voice still hoarse with sleep. The answer came dryly, mechanically, without any trace of humanity. "This is the religious police. Your brother Khalid was detained at King Khalid International Airport 2 hours ago. He was trying to leave the country illegally." My heart began to race, but I still didn't grasp the gravity of the situation. "We found prohibited materials in your luggage," the impersonal voice continued. "Christian books, a Bible translated into Arabic." He didn't deny anything. He confessed everything during the interrogation. Apostasy. That word fell on me like a stone. Apostasy. The most serious, unforgivable, most fatal crime of all in the kingdom. It means abandoning Islam, betraying the faith, turning your back on Allah, and the punishment is always the same: public execution. "That's impossible," I murmured, but my own voice seemed to come from afar, as if it belonged to someone else. "Khalid is a petroleum engineer. He works for the national company. He's a respected professional, an exemplary citizen." The voice on the other end showed no compassion. "He was. Now he's a traitor to the faith. And you, as Imam and as the elder brother responsible for him, must appear before the religious council early tomorrow morning. 9 o'clock sharp. Don't be late." And then, silence. I sat in the dark, holding the phone, as if it could give me some answer, some explanation that made sense. Khalid, my younger brother, 7 years younger than me, the boy who followed me everywhere in the house after our parents died in that terrible car accident. He was only 11 years old, and I became both father and mother to him. I taught him everything I knew. I taught him the prayers, the rituals, the surahs of the Quran. I shaped his faith with my own hands. Or at least, that's what I thought I did. Where did I go wrong? Dawn arrived before I was ready. At 9 in the morning, I parked in front of the imposing building of the Religious Council, a modern structure of light stone and mirrored glass right in the center of Riyadh. A guard led me through the silent corridors to an intimidating meeting room. The floor was polished black marble, reflecting the lights from the ceiling. The walls were covered with verses from the Quran written in golden Arabic calligraphy, each letter perfectly drawn. 7 men were already waiting for me, seated in a line behind a long table that dominated the room. I knew each of them personally. I had shared meals in their homes, debated theological interpretations late into the night, exchanged stories and laughter at social gatherings. But at that moment, their faces were cold masks, devoid of any trace of friendship or familiarity. "Imam al-Fahad," began Sheikh al-Harith, the patriarch of the group, whose deep voice always carried absolute authority. "Your brother committed treason against Allah, against the Prophet, and against this holy kingdom. He rejected our faith and sold himself to the religion of the Western infidels. He tried to flee like a coward, hiding in the shadows. He was captured along with his wife, who apparently shares his apostasy." The sharp voice of another council member filled the silence. "Amira too, and the 2 children. Samir is 12, Layla just turned 9. They were all seen wearing small crosses around their necks. They all openly admitted that they now follow Jesus Christ." I felt as if the ground was disappearing beneath my feet. It wasn't just Khalid. It was Amira too, that kind woman who embroidered the most beautiful robes I'd ever seen in Riyadh, whose hands created true works of art in fabric. And worse, much worse, the children, my nephew and my niece, innocent children I had held in my arms when they were babies. "The sentence is decided," declared Sheikh al-Harith, his eyes piercing mine without showing a shred of mercy. "Decapitation in a public square. It will serve as a warning to all who dare to follow this path of eternal damnation." I shook my head slowly, mechanically, though every cell in my body was screaming in revolt. I knew these laws by heart. I myself had preached about them for almost 20 years, explaining from the pulpit the importance of protecting the purity of the Islamic faith. But I never imagined that one day these words would come back to haunt me in this way. Then Al-Harith leaned over the table, bringing his face close to mine, and what he said next pierced me like an icy blade. "And it will be you, Imam al-Fahad, who will execute the sentence. You will wield the sword of justice. You will wash away the dishonor that has fallen upon your name and your lineage." The world stopped. I could only hear the sound of my own breathing, rapid and irregular. Beads of sweat began to trickle down my forehead, despite the powerful air conditioning that kept the room cold. I can't do this," I murmured, barely able to form the words. "He's my blood brother. We grew up in the same house. I slept next to him when I had nightmares after our parents died. I raised this boy. I just can't." "You can't?" Al-Harith's voice rose several tones, echoing off the gold-covered walls. "The Imam of the Grand Mosque of Riyadh refuses to uphold the sacred law of Allah. Do you also question your faith, Imam al-Fahad?" "It's not a matter of faith," I tried to argue, but my voice came out weak, desperate. "It's just that he's my brother, my blood. I can't be the instrument of his death." A heavy silence fell over the room. Then another elder spoke, his voice low but laden with calculated threat. "So you choose to share his fate. You, your wife Nadia, and your 3 children.
You will all face the same execution, publicly, in front of thousands, and I assure you, Imam al-Fahad, it will not be quick, it will not be merciful, it will be a lesson this kingdom will never forget. They dismissed me with that death sentence hanging over my head like a storm cloud. 48 hours, 2 days to decide whether I would take my own brother's life or watch my entire family be tortured and killed in the most brutal way imaginable, before meeting the same fate."
That night was the longest of my life. I couldn't close my eyes for a single second. I wandered through the empty house like a tormented spirit, stopping before each framed photograph on the walls. Khalid and I as children, with huge smiles, playing in our parents' backyard. The photo of his engineering graduation, me beside him in my best clothes, pride etched on my face. Khalid's wedding to Amira, where I conducted the entire ceremony, dressed in my imam robes, blessing that union which was now doomed. How had I come to this point? How had life placed me at this impossible crossroads? The next day, using all my influence as an imam, I managed to get permission to visit Khalid in Al-Ha'ir prison, that sinister grey concrete complex on the outskirts of the city. Armed guards led me through narrow corridors that smelled of cleaning chemicals and human despair. Finally, they stopped before a small cell, its bars rusty and stained. Khalid was sitting directly on the cold cement floor, wearing the faded orange uniform of the prisoners. When he noticed my presence, he stood up slowly. He was visibly thinner, his face marked by fatigue, but there was something different about him, something unsettling. His eyes showed no fear or despair. They showed a profound, almost supernatural serenity. There, surrounded by prison walls, facing certain death, my brother radiated a peace I had never seen in anyone. "Rashid," he said softly, walking toward the railings that separated us. "Why, Khalid?" The words escaped my throat almost like a choked scream. "Why did you do this to yourself, to your wife, to your children? Why did you throw it all away? Why did you destroy our family?" His fingers were cold, but his grip was strong. "Because I discovered what is real, Rashid. Jesus came to me 2 years ago. I was working in an isolated oil field, right in the middle of the desert. It was late at night. It must have been midnight. I was completely alone inside my tent, trying to sleep after an exhausting day. Suddenly, a light filled the entire space. It wasn't a flashlight, nor a lamplight. It was different, penetrating. And then I heard a voice, clear as if someone were beside me. "Khalid, why are you chasing me?" I was paralyzed. I wasn't chasing anyone. But I instantly understood. I was living a lie, running from the truth. "That's blasphemy," I murmured, but my own voice sounded weak, lacking any real conviction. "Perhaps so," Khalid replied, his eyes fixed on mine with that unsettling peace. "But Rashid, you know something isn't right. You've known it for a long time. You just never admitted it. You witnessed the executions. You saw the brutality. You saw how we destroyed people simply for loving whom they chose to love, for seeking freedom of thought, for wanting to know God through another path. Is that truly the desire of a merciful God?" I couldn't answer. The words were stuck in my throat. "They're going to condemn me," Khalid continued, his voice retaining that otherworldly calm. "I know exactly what comes next, and I know they're going to force you to be the executioner. It's the perfect way to destroy your spirit, to show you that they control absolutely everything in your life. I'm not going to do it," I declared firmly, though my voice trembled. "I refuse. I simply refuse. Then we will all die," Khalid replied with disconcerting calmness. "Me, Amira, Samir, Layla, and then you too. Is it worth it, brother? Is it worth letting innocent children be tortured and killed just because you refuse to make an impossible choice? What do you want from me then?" Tears began to stream down my face, uncontrollably. A respected Imam crying like a child in prison. What a shame. What a humiliation. "If you need to do this to protect my family, then do it," Khalid said, his voice low but firm as a rock. "Jesus forgave those who drove nails into his hands and thrust a spear into his side. I forgive you too, Rashid. I forgive you now, even before you raised that sword against me." Those words haunted me for the next 48 hours. They haunted me while the entire government machine moved to organize the public execution. They haunted me while servants dressed me in ceremonial robes, the immaculately white Imam's robe, the turban wrapped with mathematical precision, the leather belt decorated with sacred verses from the Quran embroidered in gold thread. They pursued me as they led me to Aldira Square, known throughout the kingdom simply as Justice Square, although justice was precisely what you wouldn't find there. It was Friday, March 23rd, just after midday prayers, when the desert sun reaches its most brutal point. The heat was stifling. The white marble of the square reflected the light with such intensity that it was impossible to look directly at the ground. Thousands of people filled every inch of the space. Some were forced to attend, part of the social control system. Others came out of morbid curiosity, that disturbing human impulse to witness the suffering of others. In the center of the square, they had erected a wooden platform, 3 meters wide by 3 meters long, raised 1 meter off the ground to ensure everyone had a full view of what was about to happen. Khalid was already there, kneeling right in the center. He wore a simple white tunic, without any embroidery, without any detail that indicated who he was or had been. Stripped of identity, reduced to just a body awaiting execution. Beside him, tied with thick ropes but without gags, were Amira, Samir, and Layla. The girl cried softly, her small body shaking with sobs that tore at my heart. Samir tried to be strong, tried to keep his head held high, but I could see the absolute terror in his child's eyes, only 12 years old. They made me climb the wooden steps up to the platform. My legs could barely carry me. One of the guards approached, carrying the executioner's sword. It was kept inside a dark red velvet sheath, treated with the reverence reserved for sacred objects. He drew it with slow, ceremonial movements, then extended it to me with both hands. The weapon was a true work of art, forged by hand, 90 centimeters from handle to tip, with a 60-centimeter blade. Authentic Damascus steel, with those characteristic wavy patterns visible on the polished surface, the result of thousands of folds of the incandescent metal during its manufacture. The handle was of black ebony inlaid with silver details, perfectly balanced, exactly 3 kilograms of weight distributed with mathematical precision. The blade was so sharp it could cut a silk thread with just its touch. I had already witnessed dozens of executions using that exact sword. I had seen it pierce through dense muscles, sever tough tendons, break bones and cartilage as if they were nothing. I had seen heads separated from bodies in fractions of a second. I knew perfectly well how efficient, how lethal, how decisive that weapon was. If this story is touching your heart right now, don't keep it to yourself. Share it now. Someone around you needs to witness what God is capable of doing. Impossible miracles happen even in the darkest moments of life. I gripped the handle with both hands, feeling its familiar weight. Years ago, when I was young and filled with religious ambition, I believed that participating in executions was a sacred honor, a service to God. I even practiced the correct movements. I knew the precise angle, 45 degrees downwards, direct impact on the third cervical vertebra, the weakest point in the human neck. I knew the ideal speed, fast enough to be efficient, but controlled enough to let the weight of the blade itself do the main work. I knew the exact force needed, enough to penetrate completely, but not so much as to unbalance me with the impact. I positioned myself directly behind Khalid. He wasn't trembling. He wasn't begging for mercy. He just kept his head down, his lips moving in silent prayer. Probably talking to Jesus, I thought bitterly, praying to the God who had brought him to that square, to that moment, to that condemnation. I raised my sword above my head, gripping it firmly with both hands in the classic execution stance. The sun beat down on the polished steel, creating a brilliant reflection that momentarily blinded some people in the crowd. The entire square fell into absolute silence. 5,000 people holding their breath at the same time create a kind of sonic vacuum that is almost deafening in its absence of sound. Khalid turned his head slightly and his eyes met mine. In that brief instant, I saw something that completely destroyed me. There was no hatred there. There was no fear, no accusation or anger. There was only forgiveness. Pure, unconditional forgiveness, humanly impossible to comprehend. "It's all right, Rashid," he whispered, so low that only I could hear. "If you need to do this to save Amira and the children, then do it. Jesus forgave those who hammered nails through his hands. I forgive you too." Something shattered inside my chest at that moment. But the training took over. Years of physical discipline, years of repetitive practice, years of conditioning. My body began to move by pure instinct, without the participation of my conscious mind. I lowered the sword with all the strength I had in my arms, all the speed my muscles could generate, all the despair that was tearing my soul apart. The blade descended toward Khalid's neck, and something completely impossible happened. The sword bent. It folded as if it were made of flexible rubber, like a piece of malleable plastic, as if that Damascus steel, forged over months, tempered in boiling oil, sharpened to cut bones, had instantly lost all its structural rigidity. The blade touched my brother's neck and simply folded over itself, forming an impossible arc. It didn't cut. It didn't penetrate. It didn't leave even a superficial scratch. No red mark. Not a drop of blood. Nothing. My brother remained kneeling, completely unharmed, looking at us with an expression as shocked as mine. The entire crowd let out a collective gasp, 5,000 people exhaling at once, creating a sound like a sudden gust of wind rushing through a narrow gorge. I raised the sword again, examining it in utter disbelief. The blade was perfectly straight once more, as if it had never been deformed. The metal reflected the merciless sun, without any visible imperfection. without any sign of what had just happened. I carefully touched the edge with the tip of my thumb. It remained as sharp as ever. "What are you doing?" the judge yelled from his elevated position beside the platform. "Complete the sentence immediately." I repositioned myself. This time, I decided to apply even more brute force. Every muscle in my back, shoulders, and arms contracted to its maximum limit. I let out a cry as I brought the sword down, releasing all the accumulated frustration, all the pain that was consuming me, all the confusion that was shattering my reality. The sword bent in exactly the same impossible way. The steel touched Khalid's neck and simply flexed like a green willow branch, bending completely without causing the slightest injury. And when I pulled the blade away, it instantly returned to its original shape, perfectly straight, as if it possessed some kind of structural memory, as if the metal itself was refusing to participate in that execution. "Impossible!" the judge shouted, his face flushed with anger mixed with panic. "Bring another sword. Now!" One of the guards ran to the armory located in the government complex next to the square. He returned 3 minutes later carrying a second executioner's sword. This one was a little heavier, with a wider and more robust blade. He handed it to me with visibly trembling hands. I tried again. Same position, same calculated angle, same applied force. The result was absolutely identical. The steel bent the instant it touched my brother's skin, flexing in a way that violated every law of physics I knew, refusing to cut. Not a scratch, not a red mark, absolutely nothing. The crowd began to murmur, first in low, hesitant voices, then louder and more agitated. The murmuring turned into nervous conversations, which quickly escalated into shouts of confusion and fear. "It's witchcraft!" someone yelled from the back of the crowd. "The apostate summoned demons to protect him." "No!" another voice replied. "It's a miracle! Allah is protecting this man!" "Allah would never protect an infidel," a third person shouted. "This is the work of—" They brought a third sword, then a fourth, then a fifth. Each one was different from the others. Varying sizes, distinct weights, diverse manufacturing styles. Some were ancient relics, centuries old, passed down through generations of executioners. Others were modern, produced with contemporary technology and high-quality steel. They all did exactly the same inexplicable thing. Every sword, without exception, bent upon touching Khalid's neck, as if his skin were more resistant than the finest steel ever forged by humanity. And after each attempt, after the impossible bend, the metal returned to its perfectly straight original shape, as if nothing abnormal had occurred. When I made the attempt with the fifth sword, complete chaos erupted in the square. Half the crowd yelled that it was witchcraft, that Khalid should be burned alive immediately. The other half insisted, shouting that it was clear divine intervention, that God himself was obviously protecting that prisoner. Some people began to physically fight amongst themselves, shoving that quickly escalated into punches and violence. The judge and the other religious leaders were in absolute panic. I saw Sheikh Al-Harith speaking frantically on his cell phone, his voice loud and desperate. He was undoubtedly calling higher authorities, asking for instructions on how to proceed. Highest-ranking officials were being mobilized to deal with this completely unprecedented disaster. Never before in the entire recorded history of Saudi Arabia had an execution gone wrong like that. Never. In the midst of that total chaos, something extraordinary unfolded. Several of the guards who had been observing the scene began to move in a coordinated and purposeful way. They were men I vaguely recognized, guards who had always seemed slightly different from the others, more reflective, less violent, silent questioners of a brutal system. I later discovered that they were part of a clandestine reform movement, men tired of the constant executions, the merciless rigidity, the total absence of pity. They took advantage of the widespread confusion. While everyone frantically debated what we had just witnessed, while the judge shouted contradictory orders, while I stood paralyzed on the platform holding a sword that refused to kill, those guards acted with surgical precision. They cut the ropes that bound Amira, Samir, and Layla. They helped Khalid to his feet. In a matter of seconds, the five simply vanished, swallowed up by the agitated crowd. When the authorities finally realized what had happened, it was too late. Khalid and his family had already been escorted out of the square, placed inside an unmarked vehicle, and taken toward the country's border. I stood there on the platform, still clutching that useless sword, still wearing my magnetic suit, still trying to process what my eyes had witnessed, but my rational mind refused to accept. Steel blades bending like rubber. 5 different swords, all behaving in ways that completely defy the laws of physics. My brother emerging completely unscathed after 6 decapitation attempts, executed with enough force to fell a tree. The guards arrested me immediately, of course. They accused me of complicity, of conspiracy, of deliberately allowing the escape. They ripped off my ceremonial robes right there, in front of everyone, publicly stripping me of every symbol of my religious authority. The turban I had worn with such pride for almost 20 years, the immaculate white robe that identified me as the Imam of the Grand Mosque, the embroidered belt that had been a gift from my mentor when I assumed that prestigious position. I stood there, practically naked, wearing only my underwear, facing thousands of eyes, humiliated in the most complete and public way possible. Then they dressed me in a faded orange prison uniform and threw me into the open back of a truck. I didn't even have the dignity of being transported in a closed vehicle. They wanted everyone to see the great Imam Al-Fahad falling from grace, being dragged through the streets like a common criminal. They locked me in the same cell where Khalid had been. The cement floor still bore the marks of where he had slept. The walls showed scratches left by his fingernails. The rancid air still carried a faint odor that mixed his fear and his strange faith. God of impossible miracles. If you believe that the same God capable of bending those swords can do the impossible in your life today, leave your amen in the comments. The first few months were a psychological hell. Interrogations that stretched on for endless hours, day after day, without a break. How did you do that? What kind of trick did you use? Was there something special about those swords? Did you put some kind of chemical on your brother's neck? Some kind of skin-toughening compound? Answer me. The same questions repeated endlessly in slightly different variations, shouted by different men, but all with the same burning hatred in their eyes. I didn't do anything at all, I replied each time, my voice growing more and more tired. I have no idea what happened. The swords simply bent on their own. I don't understand. They didn't believe me. They never believed me. Then they began to torture me, desperately seeking a confession that simply didn't exist. They didn't use direct physical violence. That would have been too obvious, leaving marks that could be documented. But they knew much more subtle and devastating methods. Total sleep deprivation, keeping me awake for days on end until I started hallucinating. Exposure to extreme temperatures, biting cold for hours that made my bones ache, followed by suffocating heat that left me on the verge of fainting. Constant deafening noises that made it impossible to form a coherent thought. Bright, uninterrupted lights illuminating the cell 24 hours a day, completely destroying my sense of time. It became impossible to know if it was morning or midnight. But the worst thing of all was something completely different. Every week, they forced me to watch videos, recordings of other successful executions carried out in the same square where I had failed, some even using the very same swords that had bent in my hands. They forced me to sit and watch heads being separated from bodies with a single, precise and accurate blow. Repeatedly, dozens of executions, hundreds of them. See? They asked, their voices filled with accusation. The swords work perfectly fine. So why didn't they work when you used them? What exactly did you do? I had no answer to give. I could only stay there, trapped in that chair, watching those screens flashing with increasingly disturbing images, showing the brutality that I myself had supported and defended for so many years. The cruelty that I had justified as necessary, the violence that I had preached as the expressed will of God. And slowly, in that cold cell, with nothing but endless time and my own torturous thoughts, I began to question absolutely everything I had believed throughout my life. If God truly desired my brother's death, why would he have prevented the execution in such a spectacular and undeniable way? If Islam was the only absolute truth, why had God shown such obvious and miraculous favor to an apostate? If we were on the right side, why did God himself seem to be protecting the one we called a heretic and traitor? These questions tormented me incessantly, day after day, night after night. And gradually, inevitably, I arrived at a radical conclusion that absolutely changed everything in my understanding of reality. The God who can bend steel before his children is the true living God, not the God of inflexible severity and summary execution, not the God of the sword that cuts and kills, but the God of the sword that refuses to cut, the God who protects instead of punishing, the God who chooses mercy over judgment. In my second year of imprisonment, in the absolute and oppressive solitude of my cell, without access to a Quran, without a prayer rug, without anything but the cold cement walls and my shattered conscience, I did something I never imagined possible. I spoke directly with Jesus. "I don't know if you really exist," I whispered in the complete darkness of the night. "I don't know if my brother was right about you, but if you are real, if it was you who bent those swords that day, I need to know the truth. I need the same impossible peace I saw in Khalid's eyes when I visited him here in this very cell. I need to know the truth, no matter what price I have to pay for it." There was no blinding light filling the cell, no audible voice echoing from the walls, no dramatic angelic apparition like in the stories, but something profound changed within me at that exact moment. An inexplicable peace began to fill the empty and painful spaces of my soul, an unwavering certainty that I was not alone there, that I had never truly been alone, that even in that dark and desperate prison, there was a divine presence with me, walking beside me. That night, I slept soundly for the first time in 2 whole years. No nightmares, no jolts. I woke up different, transformed inside, converted. The third year was considerably more tolerable. The interrogations became less frequent. The authorities had finally concluded that I genuinely didn't know how the miracle had happened, that I was probably both a victim of that event and a possible accomplice. My sentence was reduced, not out of mercy or compassion, but out of pure political expediency. Keeping me imprisoned indefinitely only continued to raise uncomfortable questions about why those swords had bent. It was easier to get released quietly and bury the matter. Finally, on a scorching August day, 3 years and 5 months after my arrest, I was summoned to the prison director's office. "Al-Fahad," he began, his voice cold and bureaucratic. He didn't even call me Imam. "Although you are no longer Imam of anything, it has been decided by the higher councils that you will be released, under extremely strict and non-negotiable conditions." He shoved a document across the table. "You have exactly 48 hours to leave Saudi Arabia. You are permanently banned from this kingdom and may never return. You are prohibited from speaking publicly about the events that occurred in the square, by any means, under any circumstances. If you violate a single one of these conditions, your original sentence will be immediately reinstated and executed without the right to a new trial or appeal." He threw some items on the table: a passport, a one-way plane ticket to Istanbul, Turkey, and $500 in crumpled bills. That's it. 3.5 years of my entire life reduced to a stamped passport and $500. I left that prison wearing exactly the same clothes I had on when I went in, the tattered remains of my orange prison uniform. I had absolutely nowhere to go in Riyadh. My house had been confiscated by the government. My bank accounts were all frozen. My old friends and colleagues avoided me in the streets as if I carried a contagious disease. I was a complete outcast, a vivid and inconvenient reminder of an event the government preferred to erase from collective memory. The flight to Istanbul was scheduled for 36 hours later. I spent all that time inside the airport, sleeping on uncomfortable plastic benches, using the public restrooms to wash myself as best I could. People passed by me casting looks of contempt or pity, not knowing my story, only seeing a man who had obviously fallen completely from grace. When the plane finally took off from Riyadh, I turned to the window and watched the city where I had spent my entire life grow smaller and smaller below. The golden desert stretched endlessly to the distant horizon. The imposing mosque towers were becoming tiny, insignificant dots. And for the first time in countless years, I felt something remotely resembling freedom. Istanbul was a vibrant chaos and architectural beauty intertwined in an impossible way. I arrived without knowing a single person, without speaking a word of Turkish, with no plan other than simply surviving another day. I spent the first few weeks sleeping in overcrowded homeless shelters, eating basic meals served in community charity kitchens, gradually learning the labyrinthine streets of a city that was definitely not mine. But God, the God of bowed swords, had completely different plans for me. One day, while wandering aimlessly through the Fatih neighborhood, I heard distant voices singing in Arabic. I followed that familiar sound until I found a discreet and simple building, with a small wooden cross hanging discreetly above the entrance door. An Arab church, I instantly realized. A meeting point for Christian refugees from various countries in the Middle East. I stopped at the entrance, hesitant. Going in there would mean publicly admitting my new faith. It would mean crossing a definitive line from which there would be absolutely no possible return. But the singing voices drew me in with an almost magnetic force, impossible to resist. I took a deep breath and pushed the door open, going inside. The congregation was small and humble, perhaps 40 people at most. Men and women, young and old, all singing with a genuine and intense passion that I had rarely witnessed in mosques, where 5,000 people prayed mechanically, without real emotion. And then, sitting in the third row, I saw something that literally stopped my heart. Khalid, my brother. He turned when he heard the door creak. Our eyes met across that simple room. 3 seconds that felt like an eternity. None of us could move at first. Then he jumped up and ran towards me with his arms wide open, tears already streaming freely down his face. We embraced right in the middle of the aisle, while the congregation continued singing around us, completely oblivious to the miraculous reunion that was taking place. We embraced like the brothers we always were, separated by prisons and forced exile, reunited by incomprehensible divine providence in a foreign city thousands of miles from home. I searched for you, Khalid whispered in my ear, his voice choked with emotion. When I learned through our contacts that you had been released, I tried to find you everywhere possible. I knew God would bring you to me. I was certain of it. Amira and the children were there too. Samir, now a tall and surprisingly confident 15-year-old. Layla, 12 years old, carrying in her eyes that same supernatural peace I had seen in her father years before. Everyone had survived. Everyone was safe. Everyone was together again, against all odds. That night, after the service ended, Khalid and his family took me to the small apartment they shared in a run-down 3-story building. They prepared a veritable feast with the little they had. Seasoned rice, roast chicken, fresh salad, still warm bread. We ate together around that simple table, talking for hours on end, alternating between tears and laughter, remembering and dreaming. "Tell me absolutely everything," Khalid finally said, his voice serious. "What happened to you after we managed to escape?" I told everything, leaving nothing out. The cold, damp prison, the calculated psychological torture, the interrogations that seemed never-ending, the devastating doubts that slowly consumed me, the lonely, desperate conversion in the darkness of my cell. When I finished my story, Khalid had tears silently streaming down his face. "God didn't bend those swords just to save me, Rashid," he said slowly, choosing each word carefully. "He bent them to save you too, to show you the truth in such an undeniable way that you couldn't simply ignore or rationalize it. You witnessed an absolutely impossible miracle, brother, and that miracle freed you from decades of spiritual blindness." He was absolutely right. All that horrible suffering had a greater purpose. God had used the darkest and most desperate moment of my life to break the invisible chains that had bound me for so long. The following months were a period of intense and transformative learning. Khalid taught me about Jesus, not the distorted and limited version presented by Islam, but the true and complete Jesus of the Gospels. I read the Bible for the first time in my entire life, and the words literally leaped off the pages with a vibrant life that I had never experienced when reading the Quran. "Blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy," I read in Matthew. Immediately I thought of all the times I had preached about rigid justice without any mercy, about severe punishment without the possibility of forgiveness. How much time I had wasted, how much harm I had caused defending that. "Love your enemies," I continued reading. "Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you." I thought about the deep hatred I harbored for non-Muslims throughout my life, the utter contempt I preached from the pulpit Sunday after Sunday. How terribly wrong I was. But I also read about radical transformation, about genuine change, about impossible new beginnings. Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, the new creation has come, the old has gone, the new is here. This was me now, a completely new creation. The old things had finally passed away. Everything had become new. 6 months after my arrival in Istanbul, the pastor of the Arab church made me an unexpected offer. "Rashid," he said, using only my name, without the title of Imam that I no longer deserved, and definitely did not want. "Your story needs to be told, not to glorify you, but to show people what God is capable of doing. Would you be willing to share your testimony next Sunday? I was terrified to preach again, but this time speaking the truth instead of the rigid doctrines I had upheld for almost 20 years. Preaching about the God who bends swords instead of the God who demands heads beheaded publicly. Even so, I agreed. That Sunday, before the small congregation of 40 refugees gathered in that simple room, I shared my complete story publicly for the first time. I spoke of my pride as a respected Imam, of my younger brother and his secret dangerous conversion, of the imprisonment and the inevitable death sentence, of the crowded public square under the scorching sun, and of the 5 different swords that simply refused to cut. Those swords, I said, my voice faltering with intense emotion, had already severed dozens of necks. I witnessed it personally. Damascus steel cuts through bone as if it were soft butter, but when they touched my brother's neck, they buckled like flexible rubber. It didn't happen just once or twice, 5 times in a row, with 5 completely different swords. The entire congregation was in absolute silence, hanging on every word that came out of my mouth. Why? I continued, my voice gaining strength. Why would God do something so dramatic, so public, so impossible to deny or explain? Because He needed to break me completely. He needed to show me in the most undeniable way possible that absolutely everything I believed in was wrong from the beginning. He needed to prove to me that the true God protects instead of destroying, loves instead of punishing, transforms instead of condemning. When I finished speaking, 20 people stood up asking for prayer. Some were former Muslims like myself, carrying their own stories of risky conversion. Others had grown up in Christian families but drifted away from the faith. All needed to hear that the God of impossible miracles still works powerfully today. If this testimony has deeply impacted you, join this faith community. Comment below, stating the country and city where you are watching from. You are not alone in your search for truth. That was the first of countless times I shared my story. The pastor began inviting me to preach at other refugee churches scattered throughout Istanbul, then to churches in other cities in Turkey. My testimony initially spread by word of mouth, then through recordings shared on social media. Saudi refugees began actively seeking me out. Some were skeptical and distrustful. Others were simply curious. Many were desperate for some kind of genuine hope. Over the next 2 years, I witnessed more than 60 former Muslims give their lives to Christ after hearing the story of the swords that bent. How do we know your story is true? Some asked me skeptically. Maybe it's an exaggeration. Maybe it never really happened that way. My answer was always the same, calm and factual. There are 5,000 witnesses who saw with their own eyes what happened in that square. The Saudi government knows perfectly well that it is true, although it prefers not to discuss the matter publicly. Religious authorities testified personally, and more important than anything else, my brother is alive today, when he should have been buried in an unmarked grave years ago. That is the miracle that absolutely no one can deny or explain. A year later, the pastor proposed something much bigger to me. There are Arab refugees scattered throughout Europe who desperately need to hear this message of hope. Would you consider expanding this ministry beyond Turkey? Thus began a completely unexpected new chapter. Khalid, his family and I moved together to a city in Western Europe, a place where thousands of refugees from the Middle East arrive every month, fleeing war, persecution, and certain death. We established a small support center focused specifically on helping former Muslims navigate their new faith and their new lives far from home. It is extremely arduous work. Many refugees arrive deeply traumatized. Some are physically injured, but all are emotionally shattered. They have lost their countries. They have lost their families. They have lost their identities and everything they knew. They desperately seek something, anything, that will give them real hope to continue. We offer them this hope, not with empty words and promises we cannot keep, but with the living and tangible testimony of what God can do when it seems impossible. We showed them Khalid, the man who survived 6 brutal beheading attempts without suffering a single scratch. They know me, the once respected Imam who preached death and damnation, but now preaches life and transformation. Sometimes during my sermons, I hold a ceremonial sword similar to those used against Khalid that day. It's a replica I bought at an antique market. Authentic Damascus steel, perfectly sharpened and balanced. I raise it high before the assembled congregation. This sword, I say, feeling that familiar weight in my hands, is exactly like the ones that should have severed my brother's head that day. It was made to kill, forged specifically to destroy, sharpened to cut through flesh and bone without resistance. But when God says no, the hardest steel in the world becomes soft as melted wax. When God declares, "I protect this man," absolutely no weapon forged against him will prosper. Then I slowly lower my sword and let my gaze sweep across the audience. I see faces of all ages and backgrounds, ex-soldiers like I once was, ex-militants who wielded real weapons against Christians, women who escaped forced and violent marriages, young people who abandoned everything to follow Jesus, entire families who crossed scorching deserts and dangerous seas in search of the freedom to worship. If God can bend forged steel, I continue, my voice gaining intensity, He can also bend the hardest heart that exists. If God can transform an imam who preached death and damnation into a pastor who preaches life and hope, He can transform absolutely anyone, no matter how far you have fallen, no matter how impossible your situation seems at this moment. The God of impossible miracles is still powerfully active today. I have witnessed absolutely miraculous conversions, like that of a former ISIS fighter who came to me completely tormented by horrific nightmares about the people he had tortured and killed. Today he works in a hospital, caring for sick refugees, desperately trying to balance the dark memories of the past with concrete acts of mercy in the present. A woman who was forced to wear a burqa her entire life, never able to show her face in public or speak to men. Today she sings joyfully in the church choir, her voice finally free, her face revealed, her spirit completely transformed. A young man who was being groomed to be a suicide bomber, completely convinced that he would reach paradise by killing infidels in a suicide attack. Today he studies pedagogy, dedicating his life to teaching refugee children, showing them that there is a better path. These are the swords that bend today. Not literal weapons of steel and metal, but entire lives that were forged for destruction, yet supernaturally transformed by God into powerful instruments of peace. The story of the 5 swords spread far beyond anything I could have imagined. It was shared millions of times through social media. Videos of my testimony were watched by people in dozens of different countries. I constantly receive messages from former Muslims in Indonesia, Malaysia, Egypt, Morocco. Some even risk everything to send me secret messages from Saudi Arabia itself. "Your story gave me real hope for the first time," wrote a man from Riyadh. "I thought I was completely alone, that I was the only one who doubted everything I had been taught. But if God transformed you so radically, He can transform me too." "The swords that bent are my personal proof," wrote a woman from Yemen. "When my own family threatens me with death because of my new faith, I remember that God can bend impenetrable steel. If He can do that, surely He can protect me too." I receive dozens of these messages every week. Each one represents a human soul desperately searching for the truth, risking absolutely everything, taking courageous steps of faith in utter darkness. And each message reminds me exactly why that horrible day in the public square was necessary. God didn't bend those swords just to save my brother's physical life. He bent them to save the spiritual lives of thousands who would hear this story in the years to come. He bent them to create a testimony so undeniable, so impossible to explain rationally, that it would destroy the skepticism of even the most cynical person. He bent them to prove definitively that He is the God of the absolutely impossible. Months ago, I received a letter that made me cry uncontrollably for over an hour. It came from Saudi Arabia, sent secretly through channels that are best left unmentioned for security reasons. He was one of the guards who helped Khalid escape that chaotic day in the square. "Dear Imam Al-Fahad," the letter began in careful handwriting. "I know you no longer use that title, but to me you will always be the courageous man who was willing to sacrifice absolutely everything in that square. I want you to know that that day also changed my life forever. I was one of the reform guards who helped your brother escape. Seeing those swords bending broke something deep inside me, or rather it built something completely new." The letter went on to explain how that guard, whose name I can never mention for his own safety, had been secretly investigating Christianity for several years. Seeing the miracle with his own eyes finally convinced him definitively. Now he leads an underground church in Riyadh with 17 active members. all former Muslims, all literally risking their lives at each secret meeting. "The swords that bent," he wrote at the end of the letter, "are our symbol of hope. When fear completely paralyzes us, when the threat of discovery and death seems very real and near, we remember God bends swords. If he could do it in a public square before 5,000 witnesses, he can certainly protect us in our secret meetings." Thank you for your courage that day, although I know it wasn't exactly voluntary courage, but forced obedience to an impossible situation. Even so, God used even that for his greater glory. I wept deeply as I read those words. 17 more people. 17 eternal souls transformed by a miracle that I tried with all my might to prevent from happening. God took my greatest personal failure and transformed it into his most powerful and lasting victory. Now, when I preach, I no longer wear the elaborate robes of an imam. I don't wear a carefully wrapped turban or a robe embroidered with gold thread. I wear simple jeans and an ordinary shirt, clothes for normal people, because that's exactly what I am today, a completely ordinary man serving an extraordinarily powerful God. But sometimes, when I hold that sword during my sermons, the memories come back vividly. I remember the weight of that steel in my trembling hands. I remember the merciless sun reflecting off the polished blade. I remember my brother's eyes staring at me, filled with a forgiveness humanly impossible to comprehend. I remember the bizarre sound of the metal bending, a sound that simply shouldn't exist, a sound that defies all known laws of physics. And I clearly remember what I learned on that transformative day, that God can take the hardest, most deadly, most definitive and irreversible things and transform them into something completely different. He can take executioners' swords and transform them into testimonies of life. He can take moments of certain death and transform them into miraculous salvation. He can take imams filled with religious hardness and transform them into shepherds overflowing with grace. Your personal sword may be completely different from mine. Perhaps it's a terminal illness that doctors say is incurable. Perhaps it's a devastating addiction that has dominated your life for years. Perhaps it's a past filled with deep shame and overwhelming guilt. Perhaps it's a family that has completely rejected you because of your newfound faith. Perhaps it's the paralyzing fear that controls you every day. But listen very carefully to these words. The same God who bent 5 different Damascus steel swords can bend your sword too. He can take what seems hardest, most impossible, most definitive in your life, and completely transform it into something new. Not because you are special or deserve it, but simply because he is the God of impossible miracles. I was imam for 18 long years. I preached severity without mercy. I supported public executions. I defended cruelty in the name of God, as an unquestionable divine will. If God could transform me so radically, he can transform absolutely anyone. My brother was condemned to a public death sentence, with his wife and young children forced to watch his brutal execution. If God could save him in such a dramatic and impossible way, he can save you too, no matter how desperate your situation may seem. The sharpest sword ever forged, crafted over months of meticulous work, tempered in intense fire, sharpened specifically to cut through human bone, simply buckled like flexible rubber upon touching my brother's skin. If God can do that with forged steel, imagine what he can do with the utterly impossible circumstances of your life today. Share this testimony right now. Someone in your contact list desperately needs to hear that God still performs impossible miracles today. Don't keep this story to yourself. The God who bent steel swords in Riyadh can bend the impossible in the life of someone you love deeply. If you are listening to this testimony now and have never given your life to Jesus, today could be your day of transformation. You don't need to be in a fancy church. You don't need to wear special clothes or speak complicated words. You just need a genuinely open and sincere heart. Pray with me right now. Jesus, I don't fully understand everything about you, but I want to truly know you. Seeing what you did with Rashid, with Khalid, with those swords impossible to bend. If you could transform an imam who preached death into a shepherd who preaches life, then you can transform me too. Forgive all my past. Enter my heart now. Be my Lord and Savior. Bend the swords in my life that seem impossible to overcome. Amen. If you prayed this prayer just now, know that you are not alone on this journey. Comment below, I have decided to follow Christ, and our team will contact you. This community is here to support you, No matter where you come from, what your past is, or what you have done, swords were bent, lives were completely transformed. The impossible became possible, and the God who made all of this possible is patiently waiting to do the exact same for you today.